In the mountains of Eastern Europe, where morning mist clings to ancient pines and silence can mean the difference between life and death, Elena Kozlov made a decision that would haunt her dreams and define her legacy. With her finger resting on the trigger of a high-powered rifle, she faced an impossible choice: follow her orders as one of the world's deadliest snipers, or risk everything to save the enemy pilot whose parachute had landed him directly in her crosshairs. What happened next defied every rule of war, challenged the boundaries of duty and compassion, and proved that sometimes the most dangerous mission isn't the one you're assigned. It's the one your heart demands you accept. This is the true story of how a single moment of mercy became the most daring rescue operation of the decade, and how two people from opposite sides of a conflict discovered that humanity can triumph even in the darkest corners of war. The morning air was sharp and cold as Elena Kozlov adjusted her position behind the weathered granite outcropping. Her breath formed small clouds in the frigid mountain air, each exhale carefully controlled to avoid detection. Through her rifle scope, she could see the valley below stretching for miles, a patchwork of snow-covered fields and dark forests that had become a battlefield in this forgotten corner of the world. Elena had been in position since before dawn, her body motionless despite the numbing cold that crept through her winter camouflage. At 28, she was already considered a legend among the Special Forces community. Her record spoke for itself. Over 200 confirmed eliminations across 3 different conflicts, each shot precise, clean, and decisive. She wasn't just a sniper. She was an artist whose canvas was the battlefield and whose brush was a custom-modified rifle that never missed its mark. The mission briefing had been straightforward, as they always were. Enemy forces were using the mountain passes to supply their forward positions, and Elena's job was to disrupt their operations by eliminating key personnel. Intelligence suggested that high-value targets would be moving through the area within the next 48 hours. She was to observe, identify, and eliminate as opportunities presented themselves. But nothing about this morning felt routine. The radio crackled softly in her earpiece. "Go 7. This is command. We're tracking multiple aircraft heading toward your sector. Stay alert for possible extraction scenarios." Elena pressed her throat mic. "Copy, command. I have clear sight lines on the primary routes. Standing by." As she spoke, a distant rumble filled the air. Elena lifted her eyes from the scope to see 3 military aircraft moving across the grey morning sky, flying low and fast through the mountain corridor. Even from her position nearly 2 miles away, she could make out their sleek profiles cutting through the clouds. Then the world exploded. A streak of light rose from somewhere in the valley, followed by another, then a third. Surface-to-air missiles, their trails like deadly fireworks against the overcast sky. The lead aircraft banked hard to the left, trying to evade, but the second missile found its mark. Elena watched through her scope as the plane erupted in a ball of orange flame, debris spinning away from the explosion like deadly confetti. Through the chaos, she saw something else: a parachute deploying from the burning aircraft, a small white flower blooming against the dark sky. The pilot had managed to eject, but his troubles were just beginning. Elena tracked the parachute's descent, her mind automatically calculating wind patterns and landing zones based on years of experience. He was coming down in a clearing roughly 800 meters from her position. If he survived the landing, he would be deep in enemy territory, alone and vulnerable. Standard protocol was clear. Enemy combatants were targets of opportunity. But something made Elena hesitate. The parachute disappeared behind a ridge of pine trees. Elena grabbed her field pack and began moving, her body flowing through the forest with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to become invisible. She moved from shadow to shadow, using the natural contours of the land to mask her approach. 20 minutes later, she reached the edge of the clearing where the pilot had landed. Elena dropped to a prone position behind a fallen log and raised her rifle, scanning the area through her scope. The parachute was tangled in the branches of a tall pine at the far end of the clearing, the white fabric fluttering like a surrender flag in the morning breeze. But where was the pilot? Movement caught her attention near the base of the tree. A figure in a flight suit was struggling to free himself from the parachute harness, his movement sharp and pained. Even from this distance, Elena could see that he was injured. His left arm hung at an odd angle, and dark stains on his flight suit suggested bleeding from multiple wounds. Elena centered her crosshairs on the figure. At this range, it would be a simple shot. The pilot was completely exposed, focused on his own survival and unaware of her presence. One squeeze of the trigger, and her mission parameters would be satisfied. Another enemy combatant eliminated, another threat removed from the battlefield. But as she watched him struggle, something unexpected happened. The pilot stopped his efforts to free the parachute and instead began gathering the white fabric, carefully folding it despite his obvious pain. Elena realized what he was doing. He was trying to hide any evidence of his landing, attempting to minimize the chances that enemy forces would find his location. It was a smart tactical move, but more than that, it showed discipline and training under extreme stress. This wasn't some frightened rookie who had panicked and ejected at the first sign of trouble. This was a professional soldier, someone who understood that survival meant thinking clearly even when everything had gone wrong. Elena kept her rifle trained on him but found herself studying his face through the scope. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with short dark hair and sharp features marked by concentration and pain. When he turned slightly, she could see Lieutenant's bars on his collar and a name tag that read Morrison. Morrison continued his methodical preparation for evasion despite his injuries. He buried the parachute under a pile of fallen branches, then began applying field dressings to his wounds with practiced efficiency. Elena watched him work, noting the steady control of his hands despite what had to be significant pain. The radio in her ear crackled again. Ghost 7, command. Report status. Elena hesitated for a moment before responding. Ghost 7 in position, continuing observation. Copy. Be advised, enemy search teams are mobilizing. Multiple units moving toward the crash site. Recommend you relocate to secondary position. Through her scope, Elena could see that Morrison had heard something too. His head had come up, alert and listening. Then she heard it as well. The distant sound of engines and voices growing closer. The enemy search teams were already closing in. Morrison gathered his survival kit and began moving toward the tree line, but his progress was slow and unsteady. The injuries were affecting his mobility more than he wanted to admit. At this pace, the search teams would find him within the hour. Elena made a decision that went against every aspect of her training and mission protocol. She safetied her rifle and began moving through the forest toward the wounded pilot's position. She told herself it was tactical reconnaissance, that she needed to get closer to properly assess the situation. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. When she was 50 meters away, Elena made a controlled noise, snapping a branch underfoot deliberately. Morrison spun toward the sound, a sidearm appearing in his hand with impressive speed despite his injuries. Elena stepped out from behind a tree, her rifle lowered but ready, and for a moment they simply stared at each other across the forest clearing. "You're injured," Elena said in accented English, her voice barely above a whisper. Morrison kept his pistol trained on her, his eyes taking in her winter camouflage, her rifle, and the professional way she moved. "You're not with the search teams," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," Elena replied, "I'm not." They stood in the forest silence, two soldiers from opposite sides of a conflict, each trying to read the other's intentions. Elena could hear the search teams getting closer, their voices and equipment noise carrying through the thin mountain air. "They're coming," she said, nodding toward the approaching sounds. "You won't make it far with those injuries." Morrison's grip on his pistol never wavered, but Elena could see the calculation in his eyes. He was wounded, alone, and deep in enemy territory. His chances of evading capture or reaching friendly lines were minimal at best. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Elena considered the question. Why was she here? Why hadn't she simply taken the shot and completed her mission? The answer was complicated, tied up in years of war and death and a growing weariness with the endless cycle of violence. "Because," she said finally, "I think we both deserve better than this." The sound of the search teams grew louder. Soon they would reach the clearing where Morrison had landed, and from there it wouldn't take long to track his movement through the forest. Elena made another decision that would have been impossible to explain to her commanders. "Come with me," she said. "I know these mountains. I can get you somewhere safe." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, his pistol still raised. Elena waited, knowing that whatever happened next would change both of their lives forever. In the distance, she could hear dogs barking. The search teams had brought tracking animals. "Why would you help me?" Morrison asked. Elena met his eyes steadily. "Because sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do." Morrison slowly lowered his weapon. "Lead the way." Elena turned and began moving deeper into the forest, Morrison following despite his obvious pain. Behind them, the voices of the search teams grew closer, but Elena was no longer thinking about her mission parameters or her commanding officer's expectations. She was thinking about the choices that define us, and how sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that no one else will ever understand. As they moved through the mountain wilderness, Elena realized that she had just begun the most dangerous mission of her career. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was fighting for something that mattered more than orders or politics or the endless complications of war. She was fighting for the simple idea that even in the darkest places, human decency could still mean something. The forest closed around them as they disappeared into the wilderness. Two unlikely allies bound together by circumstance and a shared recognition that some things transcend the arbitrary lines drawn by governments and armies. Elena had made her choice, and there would be no going back. The sharpshooter had found a target worth saving instead of destroying, and everything that followed would be a testament to that moment of mercy in the cold mountain morning. Elena led Morrison deeper into the mountain wilderness, following animal trails that were barely visible even to her trained eyes. Every few minutes, she would stop and listen, her head tilted to catch the sounds of pursuit that she knew were inevitable. Morrison moved behind her with determined silence, though she could tell from his breathing that the pain from his injuries was significant. The forest around them was ancient and thick, with towering pines that blocked most of the morning light. Snow crunched softly under their boots despite Elena's efforts to choose the quietest path possible. She was moving them generally northeast, toward a series of caves she had discovered during her initial reconnaissance of the area. It would provide temporary shelter while she figured out what to do next. After an hour of steady movement, Morrison finally spoke. "We need to stop," he said quietly. "I'm losing too much blood." Elena turned to see that the dark stains on his flight suit had spread considerably. His face was pale, and she could see the effort it was taking him to stay upright. She had pushed him hard, knowing that distance from the crash site was their best immediate protection, but she realized now that he wouldn't make it much further without medical attention. "There's a shelter ahead," she said. 10 more minutes." Morrison nodded grimly and continued following her through the trees. Elena quickened her pace slightly, concerned about the amount of blood he was losing. She had basic medical training, but treating serious trauma injuries in the field was always challenging, especially when they were still being hunted. The cave she had in mind was actually more of an overhang, a natural shelter formed by centuries of water erosion against a granite cliff face. It was well hidden behind a screen of pine branches and provided protection from both the weather and any aerial observation. Elena had used it as a temporary base during her first week in the mountains. When they reached the shelter, Morrison collapsed onto the rocky floor with obvious relief. Elena immediately began examining his injuries in the dim light filtering through the pine branches. His left shoulder was dislocated, explaining why his arm hung at that odd angle, and he had several pieces of aircraft debris embedded in his leg and torso. "How bad is it?" Morrison asked, watching her face as she assessed the damage. "You'll live," Elena replied, though privately she was more concerned than she wanted to admit. "But some of this metal needs to come out, and we need to reset your shoulder." Elena opened her field medical kit and began laying out supplies. She had morphine, but using it would make Morrison less alert, which could be dangerous if they needed to move quickly. Instead, she offered him a piece of leather to bite down on. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Morrison nodded and gripped the leather between his teeth. Elena worked quickly and efficiently, removing the smaller pieces of debris and cleaning the wounds as best she could with the supplies available. Morrison's breathing was controlled but strained, and she could see sweat on his forehead despite the cold air. The shoulder would be the worst part. Elena positioned herself behind him and placed her hands carefully on his arm and shoulder blade. "On 3, she said. 1, 2. She reset the joint on 2, knowing that the anticipation was often worse than the actual procedure. Morrison's body went rigid with pain, but he didn't cry out. The shoulder clicked back into place with an audible pop, and Elena immediately began fashioning a sling from parachute cord and fabric from her pack. "Military training?" Morrison asked through gritted teeth as she worked. "Something like that," Elena replied, focusing on her work. She wasn't ready to discuss her background with him yet, though she suspected he had already figured out that she wasn't a regular infantry soldier. As she finished bandaging his wounds, Elena's radio crackled softly. She had turned the volume down to its lowest setting, but both of them could hear the transmission. "Ghost 7, this is command. Report your status immediately." Elena ignored the radio, but Morrison was watching her carefully. "Ghost 7?" he asked. "My call sign," Elena admitted. "And Ghost 7 is a sniper," Morrison said. It wasn't a question. Elena met his eyes. "Yes." Morrison was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "You were supposed to kill me, weren't you?" "Those were my orders," Elena said simply. "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." Morrison leaned back against the cave wall, studying her face. "Why not?" Elena considered the question while she packed up her medical supplies. It was the same question she had been asking herself since the moment she had decided to help him instead of completing her mission. "I've killed a lot of people," she said finally. "Most of them were soldiers like you, good people following orders, trying to do their duty. After a while, you start to wonder if there's any point to it all." The radio crackled again. "Ghost 7, respond immediately or we will consider your position compromised." Elena knew she had to respond eventually, but she wasn't sure what she was going to tell them. How do you explain to your commanding officer that you had abandoned a mission to save an enemy pilot? How do you justify putting one person's life above your duty to your unit and your country? "They're going to come looking for you," Morrison said. Elena nodded. "I know. And when they find out what you've done?" "That depends on whether we can get you out of here alive," Elena said. "If you make it back to your people, maybe this ends up being worth something. If not," she didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood the implications. Elena had committed an act that could be viewed as treason, depending on how it was interpreted by her superiors. Her career was over, and possibly her life as well. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, watching Elena as she organized their limited supplies and planned their next move. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "If we're going to do this together, I should know who I'm trusting with my life." Elena considered how much to reveal. Operational security was still important, even in their current circumstances. But Morrison was right. If they were going to survive the next few days, they needed to trust each other. "Elena Kozlov," she said, 28 years old. "I've been a sniper for 8 years, most of it in places that don't officially exist on any maps. Family? Had a brother. He was killed in the early days of this conflict." Elena's voice was steady, but Morrison could hear the pain underneath. "What about you?" "Captain James Morrison, United States Air Force. 32 years old. I was supposed to be on leave next week to visit my sister and her kids in Colorado." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside their shelter, the forest was quiet except for the wind moving through the pine branches, but Elena knew that the silence was deceptive. Search teams were combing the mountain, getting closer with every hour that passed. Her radio crackled again, and this time, the voice was different. "Harsher. Ghost 7, this is Colonel Petrov. You will respond immediately or face court-martial for dereliction of duty." Elena recognized the voice of her commanding officer, a man she had served under for 3 years and respected greatly. Hearing the anger and disappointment in his tone made her chest tighten with guilt, but she still couldn't bring herself to respond. Morrison watched her struggle with the decision. "You can still change your mind," he said quietly. "Turn me in, complete your mission. Tell them you were gathering intelligence or something." Elena looked at him. This enemy pilot who was giving her an opportunity to save her own career and reputation. The offer was genuine. She could see it in his eyes. He was willing to sacrifice himself if it would protect her from the consequences of her choice. "No," Elena said firmly. "I made my decision. I'm not changing my mind now." Morrison nodded, a slight smile crossing his face despite their dangerous situation. "Then we better figure out how to get out of these mountains alive." Elena moved to the mouth of the cave and peered through the pine branches. In the distance, she could see movement on the opposite slope. The search teams were spreading out, using a grid pattern to systematically cover every possible hiding spot. They had dogs with them, which would make avoiding detection much more difficult. "We need to move tonight," she said. "They're getting close, and the dogs will pick up our scent trail soon." "Where are we going?" Elena pulled out a small tactical map and spread it on the cave floor. She had marked several key locations during her weeks of reconnaissance, including potential extraction points and enemy positions. "There's an old mining road about 15 kilometers north of here," she said, pointing to a thin line on the map. "It's not used anymore, but it connects to a larger road that leads toward the border. If we can make it that far, you might have a chance of reaching friendly territory." Morrison studied the map, noting the terrain features and the scale of the distance involved. 15 kilometers through mountain wilderness, while injured, being pursued by search teams with dogs. Yes. Those aren't very good odds. Elena folded up the map and looked at him directly. "No, they're not. But they're the only odds we have." Morrison was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "When do we leave?" "After dark. We'll move at night and hide during the day until we're clear of the immediate search area." Elena spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for their escape attempt. She redistributed the contents of her pack, keeping only the most essential items, and leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival. She also began modifying Morrison's flight suits, adding patches of camouflage material to break up its distinctive outline. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of orange and gold, Elena made one final decision. She took out her radio and, for the first time since the morning, opened a channel to her command. "Command, this is Ghost 7. The response was immediate. "Ghost 7, Colonel Petrov. Report your status and location immediately." Elena took a deep breath. "Colonel, I am unable to comply with mission parameters at this time." There was a long pause before Petrov responded, his voice cold with barely controlled anger. "Explain yourself, Sergeant Kozlov. I have encountered complications that require alternative solutions." "Ghost 7, you will return to base immediately for debriefing." Elena looked at Morrison, who was listening to the conversation with intense interest. She made her choice. "Negative, Command. I am currently engaged in a priority operation that supersedes previous orders." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Petrov spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "Sergeant Kozlov, you are hereby ordered to cease all unauthorized activities and return to base immediately. Failure to comply will result in your classification as a deserter and potential enemy collaborator." Elena closed her eyes, knowing that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. "Understood, Colonel. Ghost 7 going dark." She turned off the radio and removed the battery, effectively cutting all communication with her unit. Morrison was staring at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You just burned every bridge you had," he said. Elena secured the disabled radio in her pack and checked her weapons one final time. "Yes, I did. Now let's make sure it was worth it." As darkness fell over the mountains, Elena and Morrison prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary and begin a journey that would test every skill they possessed and every assumption they had about loyalty, duty, and the meaning of doing what's right. The hunter had become the hunted, and their survival would depend on trusting each other completely in a world where trust could mean the difference between life and death. The mountain night was bitter cold and filled with the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow sound itself. Elena moved through the forest like a shadow, her years of training allowing her to navigate the treacherous terrain with minimal noise despite the snow-covered ground. Behind her, Morrison followed as quietly as his injuries would allow, though Elena could hear his labored breathing in the thin mountain air. They had been moving for 3 hours, when Elena suddenly stopped and raised her hand for silence. Morrison froze beside her, straining his ears to hear whatever had caught her attention. After several long moments, Elena heard it again. The distant baying of tracking dogs, carried on the cold wind from somewhere behind them. "They found our trail," Elena whispered. Morrison nodded grimly. They both knew this had been inevitable. Despite Elena's best efforts to mask their path, tracking dogs were nearly impossible to evade completely, especially when one of them was leaving blood traces from his wounds. Elena studied their surroundings in the pale moonlight that filtered through the pine canopy. They were moving through a valley between two ridgelines, following a frozen stream that would eventually lead them toward the old mining road. But the narrow valley also made them vulnerable, with limited options for changing direction if the pursuit got too close. "We need to split up," Morrison said quietly. Elena turned to look at him. "What?" "They're following both our scent trails, but mine is stronger because of the blood. If we split up, they'll follow me and you can get clear." "That's not happening," Elena said firmly. "Think about it tactically," Morrison pressed. "You're more valuable than I am. You know these mountains, you have the skills to evade them indefinitely. If we stay together, they'll catch both of us." Elena resumed moving through the forest, forcing Morrison to follow her. "We stay together. That's not negotiable." Morrison wanted to argue, but he could hear the determination in her voice and knew that further discussion would be pointless. Elena had made a decision to help him, and she wasn't going to abandon him now, no matter how practical it might be. They continued moving through the valley, but Elena could hear the dogs getting closer. The search teams were moving faster than she had expected, probably using night vision equipment and following established trails instead of trying to track them step by step. At their current pace, the pursuers would catch up to them within the hour. Elena began looking for alternatives, scanning the steep slopes on either side of the valley for any possible escape route. Most of the terrain was too steep and unstable for safe climbing, especially at night with an injured companion. But then she spotted something that might work. A rocky outcropping about halfway up the eastern slope that looked like it might provide access to the ridge above. "Can you climb?" she asked Morrison. Morrison followed her gaze to the steep slope, In daylight, maybe. At night, with these injuries. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Elena studied the terrain more carefully. The initial approach was manageable, but there was a section about 20 meters up that looked nearly vertical. Under normal circumstances, she could make the climb easily. With Morrison injured and in the dark, it would be extremely dangerous. But dangerous was better than certain capture. We're going to try it, Elena decided. Stay close to me and don't look down. They left the stream bed and began working their way up the slope. The footing was treacherous, with loose rocks hidden under the snow and ice coating many of the handholds. Elena tested each step carefully before committing her weight, while Morrison followed in her footsteps as precisely as possible. The sound of the dogs was getting louder, and Elena could now see flashlight beams cutting through the trees in the valley below. The search teams were moving quickly, confident that their quarry was trapped in the narrow valley with nowhere to go. Elena reached the base of the vertical section and looked up at the rock face above her. In the moonlight, she could see cracks and ledges that would provide handholds, but the route was far from obvious. She would have to climb by feel, testing each grip carefully to make sure it would support both their weights. I'm going to go first, she told Morrison quietly. When I reach a secure position, I'll drop a rope down for you. Elena began climbing, her fingertips searching for solid holds in the freezing rock. The granite was covered with a thin layer of ice that made every grip precarious, and she could feel the cold numbing her fingers despite her gloves. But she climbed steadily upward, drawing on years of mountain training and the absolute necessity of success. 15 meters up, she found a narrow ledge that would support her weight and provide an anchor point for a rope. Elena secured herself with climbing gear and dropped a line down to Morrison, who had been watching the flashlights in the valley below with growing anxiety. Okay, Elena whispered down to him. Clip in and start climbing. Use the rope for security, but don't put all your weight on it. Trust your feet. Morrison began the ascent, moving much more slowly than Elena had. His injured shoulder made it difficult to maintain proper climbing form, and several times Elena heard rocks scraping against the cliff face as he struggled to find secure holds. But he kept climbing, driven by the sound of the search teams getting closer in the valley below. When Morrison reached the ledge, both of them were breathing hard from exertion and stress. But they weren't finished yet. The ridge was still another 30 meters above them, and Elena could see that the route would be even more challenging. How are you holding up? She asked quietly. Morrison flexed his injured shoulder carefully. I'll make it. They continued climbing, and Elena began to feel cautiously optimistic about their chances. The search teams below seemed to be following the stream bed, assuming that their quarry would stick to the easiest route through the valley. By taking to the steep terrain, Elena and Morrison had done something unexpected, buying themselves time and distance. But then Morrison's foot slipped. Elena heard the scrape of his boot against rock, followed by the sharp intake of breath that every climber dreaded. Morrison's weight came onto the rope suddenly, and Elena felt the impact through her anchor system. She braced herself against the rock face, her muscles straining to absorb the shock of his fall. You okay? Elena whispered urgently. Yeah, Morrison replied. But she could hear the tension in his voice. Lost my footing. Give me a second. Morrison found new holds and took his weight off the rope. But the incident had cost them precious time and energy. Elena could see that he was reaching his limits, pushed beyond what his injured body could reasonably handle. But they were close to the ridge now, close enough that she could see the skyline against the stars. 10 more meters. That was all they needed. Elena continued climbing, moving as quickly as she dared while still maintaining security for both of them. Behind her, Morrison followed with grim determination, his breathing labored but steady. She could hear him talking to himself quietly, probably using mental techniques to manage the pain and exhaustion. When Elena finally reached the ridge, she wanted to collapse with relief. But instead, she secured herself and helped Morrison up the final few meters of the climb. When he rolled onto the relatively flat ground of the ridge, both of them lay still for several minutes, catching their breath and letting their stressed muscles recover. From their new vantage point, they could see the search teams spread out across the valley below. The flashlights looked like fireflies moving through the darkness, following a grid pattern that would eventually cover the entire valley floor. Elena counted at least a dozen lights, which meant there were probably twice that many searchers overall. They're really serious about finding us, Morrison observed quietly. Elena nodded. The question is, how far are they willing to follow? They began moving along the ridge, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. The terrain up here was easier, with gentle slopes covered in snow that muffled their footsteps. But it was also more exposed, and Elena knew that they would be visible from a great distance if anyone happened to look up from the valley. After an hour of steady movement, they reached a point where the ridge began to descend toward the north. Elena consulted her mental map and estimated that they were now about 8 kilometers from the old mining road that represented their best chance of escape. The hardest part of the climb was behind them, but they still had a long way to go. "We'll rest here for a few minutes," Elena decided. "Eat something, check your injuries." They found shelter in a small depression behind some boulders, where Elena allowed herself to use a small flashlight for the first time since leaving the cave. Morrison's wounds were holding up reasonably well, though she could see that the climbing had reopened some of the cuts on his legs. "How much further?" Morrison asked, while Elena rewrapped his bandages. "Maybe 7 more kilometers to the road. After that, it depends on what we find when we get there." Morrison ate an energy bar from Elena's pack and took small sips from her water bottle. "What's your plan once we reach the road?" Elena had been thinking about that question for hours. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Best case scenario, we find a way to get you across the border. Worst case," she didn't finish the sentence. "Worst case, we both end up dead or captured," Morrison said matter-of-factly. "Yes." Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering their situation. "You know, when I woke up this morning, I never imagined I'd be sitting on a mountain ridge in the middle of the night being hunted by search teams with a sniper who decided not to kill me." Elena smiled slightly in the darkness. "It's been an unusual day. That's one way to put it." They resumed moving along the ridge, and Elena began to feel more confident about their chances. The search teams in the valley were falling behind, probably assuming that their quarry couldn't have climbed out of the valley in the dark. The night air was cold but clear, and Elena's familiarity with the terrain was giving them a significant advantage. But then she saw the helicopter. It was just a distant sound at first, the distinctive whoop, whoop, whoop of rotor blades cutting through the night air. Elena immediately guided Morrison toward a cluster of large rocks that would provide overhead cover, and they pressed themselves against the cold stone as the aircraft passed overhead. The helicopter was equipped with a powerful searchlight that swept back and forth across the landscape, turning night into day wherever it touched. Elena could hear the aircraft circling, probably following a search pattern designed to cover the most likely escape routes. "Thermal imaging," Morrison said quietly. "What?" "The helicopter probably has thermal imaging equipment. Our body heat will show up like beacons against the cold ground." Elena felt her heart sink. She had been thinking about evading visual searches and tracking dogs, but thermal imaging changed everything. There was no way to hide their body heat, especially when they were moving across open terrain. The helicopter began another pass, this time flying directly over their position. Elena and Morrison pressed themselves as deeply into the shadows of the rocks as possible, but they both knew it was probably hopeless. If the aircraft was equipped with military-grade thermal imaging, they had already been spotted, but the helicopter continued past without stopping, its searchlight probing other areas of the ridge. Elena began to hope that maybe their hiding spot was more effective than she had thought, or perhaps the aircraft wasn't equipped with thermal equipment after all. Then the helicopter turned and began flying back toward their position, this time moving much more slowly and deliberately. Elena knew they had been found. "Run," she told Morrison. They broke from cover and began moving as quickly as possible along the ridge, abandoning any pretense of stealth in favor of speed. Behind them, the helicopter's searchlight swept back and forth, trying to reacquire them visually to confirm what the thermal equipment had detected. Elena led Morrison down the north face of the ridge, using the steep terrain to break line of sight with the aircraft overhead. They were sliding and scrambling more than climbing now, risking injury in exchange for speed and concealment. The helicopter was calling in their position over the radio, and Elena could imagine the search teams in the valley redirecting their efforts to intercept them. Time was running out, and they still had several kilometers to go before reaching the mining road. But Elena had one more trick to try. During her reconnaissance of the area, she had identified several locations that might provide temporary concealment from aerial searches. One of them was less than a kilometer ahead, an old mining shaft that went deep enough underground to shield them from thermal detection. If they could reach it before the ground teams closed in, they might still have a chance. Elena pushed Morrison harder than she should have given his injuries, but she could see no alternative. The helicopter was coordinating the entire search effort now, and their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. They needed to disappear completely and immediately, or their escape attempt would end in capture or death. The entrance to the mine shaft was hidden behind a screen of pine branches, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Elena had marked it on her mental map weeks ago as a potential emergency shelter, never imagining she would actually need to use it. She pulled aside the branches, and shone her flashlight into the darkness beyond. The shaft went straight down for about 3 meters, then opened into a larger chamber that had been carved out by miners decades earlier. It would be cold and uncomfortable, but it would hide them from thermal detection and provide a secure place to wait while the search teams passed by. "Down we go," Alina said. Morrison looked into the dark hole with obvious reluctance, but he could hear the helicopter getting closer. He went first, rappelling down on Elena's rope while she covered the entrance behind them with pine branches and snow. When Elena joined him in the underground chamber, they were both shivering from cold and exhaustion. But for the first time since leaving the cave, they were truly hidden. The earth around them would mask their heat signatures, and the sound of the helicopter overhead was muffled by several tons of rock and soil. They had survived another close call, but Elena knew that their problems were far from over. The search teams would continue looking for them, and every hour they remained in the mountains increased the chances of eventual capture. They needed to reach the mining roads soon, before their strength gave out or their luck finally ran out. But for now, in the darkness of the abandoned mine, they were safe. Elena allowed herself a moment of cautious hope that maybe, against all odds, they might actually make it out of this alive. Alan awoke to the sound of Morrison's labored breathing echoing off the stone walls of their underground refuge. The abandoned mine shaft had provided them with safety through the night, but the cold and dampness had taken their toll. When she checked her watch, she was surprised to see that they had slept for nearly 6 hours. Her body had been more exhausted than she had realized. Morrison was still asleep, but his breathing was shallow and rapid. Elena used her small flashlight to examine him more carefully and didn't like what she saw. His face was pale and clammy, and when she checked his pulse, it was faster than it should be. The combination of blood loss, physical exertion, and exposure was pushing his body toward its limits. She gently shook his shoulder to wake him. Morrison's eyes opened slowly, and it took him a moment to focus on her face in the dim light. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked quietly. Morrison tried to sit up, but immediately grimaced with pain. "Like I got hit by a truck," he admitted, then fell off a cliff, then spent the night in a freezing cave. Elena helped him into a sitting position and offered him water from their dwindling supply. She was concerned about his condition, but there wasn't much she could do about it in their current circumstances. They needed to get moving again soon, before the search teams expanded their area of operations. "Can you travel?" she asked. Morrison nodded, though Elena could see it took effort. "I'll make it. How much further to this road you mentioned?" Elena consulted her mental map, trying to estimate their current position based on the terrain features she remembered from the previous night's journey. "Maybe 4 kilometers, but it's going to be the hardest part yet. We'll be crossing open ground for most of it." They climbed out of the mine shaft into the grey morning light, and Elena immediately began scanning for signs of the search teams. The forest around them was quiet, but that could mean anything. Professional military units could move through terrain like this without making any noise at all. Elena led Morrison through the trees, toward what she hoped would be their final approach to the mining road. The terrain was more open here, with fewer hiding places and longer sightlines that made concealment difficult. But it was also faster traveling, and Elena was increasingly concerned about Morrison's condition. They had been moving for an hour when Elena spotted the first checkpoint. Through her small binoculars, she could see a military vehicle parked across the old mining road, about 2 kilometers ahead of their position. Soldiers were positioned around the vehicle, and Elena could make out at least one heavy machine gun mounted on the truck. It was a professional setup, designed to intercept anyone trying to use the road to reach the border. "They're ahead of us," Elena told Morrison, handing him the binoculars. Morrison studied the checkpoint for several minutes, noting the positions of the soldiers and the fields of fire covered by their weapons. "At least 8 men," he said. "Maybe more in the truck. Professional military, not militia." Elena knew that trying to fight their way through the checkpoint would be suicide. Even if she could eliminate some of the soldiers with her rifle, there were too many of them, and they had superior firepower and position. She needed a different approach. "What about going around?" Morrison suggested. Elena had already considered that option. "The road follows a valley between 2 ridge lines. Both sides are too steep to climb with you injured, and they probably have observation posts covering the alternate routes anyway." They were trapped. The search teams behind them were getting closer, and the checkpoint ahead blocked their path to safety. Elena felt the weight of her decision to help Morrison settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had risked everything to save his life, and now it looked like they were both going to die anyway. But then she had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if you surrendered? She asked Morrison. Morrison stared at her. What? Think about it. You're a legitimate prisoner of war. They have to treat you according to the Geneva Convention. I could get you close to the checkpoint, then you walk in with your hands up. And what about you? Elena was quiet for a moment, working through the implications of her plan. I disappear back into the mountains. Without you to worry about, I can evade them indefinitely. Morrison shook his head immediately. That's not happening. You've risked too much already to just abandon me now. It's not abandoning you. It's ensuring that at least one of us survives. Elena, listen to me. If you leave me at that checkpoint, they're going to interrogate me. They're going to want to know how I survived, who helped me, everything that happened since my plane was shut down. How long do you think it will be before they figure out that a sniper went rogue to save my life? Elena hadn't fully considered that angle, but she realized Morrison was right. Her own people would eventually put the pieces together, especially when they discovered that she had disappeared at the same time Morrison had evaded capture. Her commanding officer would remember her failure to respond to radio calls, and the timeline would make the truth obvious. So, what do you suggest? Elena asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the checkpoint through the binoculars. What if we could create a distraction? Something that would pull some of those soldiers away from the road? Elena considered the idea. What kind of distraction? You're a sniper. Could you hit their radio equipment from here? Elena looked at the distance to the checkpoint and estimated the wind conditions. Probably. But that would just make them more alert, not draw them away. What about their vehicle? Could you disable it? Elena studied the truck more carefully. If she could hit the engine block or the fuel tank, it might create enough of an emergency to justify sending soldiers away from the checkpoint to get help. But it was a risky plan, and there were a lot of things that could go wrong. It might work, Elena said slowly. But once I fire that shot, they'll know our general position. We'd have to move immediately. Morrison nodded. Better than our current options. Elena found a concealed shooting position behind a fallen log, about 1,500 meters from the checkpoint. At this range, she would need to account for wind drift and bullet drop, but it was still within her effective range. She spent several minutes studying the target and calculating her shot. When I fire, we run straight north, Elena told Morrison. There's a creek bed about 500 meters from here that should give us some concealment. We follow it downstream for about 2 kilometers, then circle back to the road beyond the checkpoint. Morrison checked his watch. How long will that take? 2 hours, maybe 3 with your injuries. And if they send patrols after us? Elena settled behind her rifle and adjusted the scope for the distance and conditions. Then we deal with them when we have to. She centered her crosshairs on the truck's engine compartment, took a deep breath, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the valley like thunder, and Elena saw the impact of her bullet spark off the truck's hood. The effect at the checkpoint was immediate. Soldiers dove for cover, shouting orders and trying to identify the direction of the sniper fire. Elena fired 2 more shots in quick succession, one hitting the truck's front tire and another shattering the windshield. Black smoke began pouring from under the hood of the truck, and Elena could see soldiers running around in apparent confusion. Then, exactly as she had hoped, 2 soldiers began moving away from the checkpoint, probably heading back along the road to report the attack and request reinforcements. Let's go, Elena said, shouldering her rifle. They ran through the forest toward the creek bed, moving as quickly as Morrison's condition would allow. Behind them, Elena could hear shouting and the sound of vehicle engines starting up. The checkpoint had been disrupted, but she knew the confusion wouldn't last long. The creek bed provided excellent concealment, with steep banks and overhanging vegetation that hid them from aerial observation. But the bottom was muddy and treacherous, and Morrison slipped several times as they made their way downstream. After an hour of difficult movement through the creek, Elena began to worry that they had made a serious mistake. Morrison was clearly reaching the end of his endurance, and they still had a long way to go to circle around the checkpoint. His breathing was becoming more labored, and she could see that he was struggling to stay upright. We need to rest, Morrison said, leaning heavily against the creek bank. Elena wanted to keep moving, but she could see that pushing Morrison any further might cause him to collapse entirely. They found a place where the creek made a sharp bend, providing them with some protection from observation, and Elena allowed them a brief rest. While Morrison caught his breath, Elena climbed to the top of the creek bank and used her binoculars to scout their surroundings. What she saw made her heart sink. There were soldiers moving through the forest on both sides of the creek, obviously following their trail. The disruption at the checkpoint had bought them some time, but not as much as she had hoped. They're closing in, she told Morrison when she returned to the creek bed. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, and Elena could see him gathering his strength for what might be their final effort. When he opened his eyes again, his expression was determined. "How much further?" he asked. "Another hour to get around the checkpoint. Maybe 2. Morrison pushed himself away from the creek bank and began moving downstream again. "Then let's finish this." They continued their difficult journey through the creek bed, but Elena could hear the search teams getting closer. The soldiers were moving systematically, checking every possible hiding place and using their superior numbers to cover more ground than 2 exhausted fugitives could hope to avoid. Then Elena heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of tracking dogs. She had been hoping that the water in the creek would mask their scent trail, but apparently the dogs had found their entry point and were following the creek bed just as they were. At the rate the animals were moving, they would catch up within minutes. Elena made a decision that went against every instinct she had developed over years of military training. Instead of continuing to run, she stopped and began looking for a defensible position. "What are you doing?" Morrison asked. "They're going to catch us anyway," Elena said, finding a spot where a large tree had fallen across the creek, creating a natural barrier. "Better to face them on ground of our choosing." Morrison understood immediately. He took up a position behind the fallen tree and checked his sidearm, though they both knew that a pistol wouldn't be much use against a squad of professional soldiers. Elena found a shooting position that gave her a clear field of fire down the creek bed. With her rifle and her training, she might be able to hold off the search team long enough for Morrison to escape. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only chance they had left. The first soldier appeared around the bend in the creek about 3 minutes later, moving cautiously with his weapon ready. Elena centered her crosshairs on his chest and waited for more targets to appear. She didn't want to fire too early and give away her position before she could engage multiple enemies. 2 more soldiers came into view, followed by a handler with one of the tracking dogs. Elena took a deep breath and prepared to fire, knowing that once she pulled the trigger, everything would change forever. But then something unexpected happened. A voice called out from behind the soldiers, speaking in accented English. "Captain Morrison, this is Major Volkov. I know you're there, and I know you're with one of our snipers. I want to talk." Elena kept her rifle aimed at the soldiers, but she was curious about this development. Morrison looked at her with raised eyebrows, clearly wondering what she thought about this new situation. "Captain Morrison," the voice called again. "I'm going to walk forward with my hands visible. I'm not armed, and I just want to talk. 5 minutes of conversation, that's all I'm asking." Elena could see a figure moving past the soldiers, hands raised and empty. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, with the bearing of a career military officer. He stopped about 50 meters away, well within Elena's effective range. "My name is Major Alexei Volkov," the man called. "I'm the commanding officer of this search operation. I know about Sergeant Kozlov, and I know what she's done to help you. I want to offer you both a way out of this situation." Elena kept her rifle trained on the major, but she was intrigued despite herself. Morrison looked at her questioningly, and she nodded slightly. "It couldn't hurt to listen." "What kind of way out?" Morrison called back. "A prisoner exchange," Major Volkov replied. "Captain Morrison surrenders himself as a legitimate prisoner of war, and Sergeant Kozlov is allowed to return to her unit without charges being filed for her actions during this operation." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. It was more than she had dared to hope for, a chance for both of them to survive the situation they had created. But she was also suspicious. Military officers didn't usually make deals in the field without authorization from higher command. "Why would you offer that?" Elena called out, speaking for the first time. Major Volkov turned slightly toward her voice, though Elena knew he couldn't see her from his position. "Because, Sergeant Kozlov, I've read your service record. You're one of the finest soldiers I've ever encountered, and losing you over this incident would be a waste that serves no one's interests." Aylin considered the offer. It was tempting, almost too good to be true. But something about the situation felt wrong, and her instincts were screaming at her to be careful. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" she asked. "Because I'm giving you my word as an officer," Major Volkov replied, "and because you don't have any other choice." That last statement carried an implied threat, and Elena suddenly understood the real situation. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a surrender demand disguised as an offer. Major Volkov was betting that she cared enough about Morrison to sacrifice herself to save him. He was right. Elena looked at Morrison one final time, seeing the same understanding in his eyes. They both knew that this was the end of their escape attempt, but maybe it didn't have to be the end of everything. "I accept your offer," Elena called out. She stood up from behind her rifle, her hands visible and empty, and stepped out from her concealed position. Morrison did the same, though Elena could see that it took significant effort for him to stand. As the soldiers moved forward to take them into custody, Elena felt a strange sense of peace. She had made her choice days ago when she decided not to pull the trigger, and everything that had happened since had been a consequence of that decision. She didn't regret it, even now. Morrison caught her eye as the soldiers approached them. "Thank you," he said quietly. Elena nodded, knowing that whatever happened next, she had done something that mattered. In a world filled with violence and hatred, she had chosen compassion instead of duty, mercy instead of orders. It might have cost her everything, but it had also proven that even in war, individual choices still mattered. The soldiers reached their position and began the process of taking them into custody. Elena surrendered her weapons without resistance, knowing that her war was over. But as they led her away from the creek bed, she couldn't help but hope that maybe, somehow, the story wasn't finished yet. Elena sat in the military detention cell, staring at the concrete wall and trying to process everything that had happened over the past week. The cell was clean but austere, with a small window that showed her a slice of grey sky. She had been here for 3 days since their capture, and during that time she had been questioned extensively by intelligence officers who seemed more puzzled than angry about her actions. Major Volkov had kept his word, at least partially. Elena hadn't been charged with treason or desertion, though she remained in custody while her case was being reviewed by higher command. Morrison had been transferred to a proper prisoner of war facility, where he would be held, according to international conventions, until a prisoner exchange could be arranged. Elena had expected to feel regret or fear about her situation, but instead she found herself strangely at peace. She had made a choice based on her conscience rather than her orders, and she was prepared to accept the consequences of that decision. The cell door opened, and Major Volkov entered, carrying a folder and wearing an expression that Elena couldn't quite read. He sat down across from her at the small table that served as the cell's only furniture. "Sergeant Kozlov," he said formally, "I have news about your case." Elena straightened in her chair, preparing herself for whatever verdict had been reached. "Yes, sir." Major Volkov opened the folder and studied its contents for a moment before speaking. "The review board has reached a decision regarding your actions during the Morrison incident. You are being transferred back to your original unit, with a formal reprimand placed in your service record."
Elena blinked in surprise.
"That's all?" "That's all," Major Volkov confirmed. "Colonel Petrov argued strongly for more severe punishment, but the board ultimately decided that your service record and the unusual circumstances of the incident warranted leniency." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. She had been prepared for court-martial, imprisonment, or worse. A formal reprimand was barely a slap on the wrist by comparison. "There is, however, one condition," Major Volkov continued. "You are being reassigned to a different unit, effective immediately. Your days as a field sniper are over." Elena had expected that. No military organization would trust a sniper who had refused to take a shot when ordered to do so. "What kind of assignment?" "Training duty. You'll be working with new recruits, teaching marksmanship and fieldcraft. It's an important position, and your experience will be valuable in preparing the next generation of soldiers." Elena nodded, accepting the decision. Teaching wasn't the career path she had planned, but it was better than prison or disgrace, and maybe there was something appropriate about using her skills to train others rather than continuing to use them to take lives.
"Thank you, Major," Elena said.
"I know you didn't have to intervene on my behalf." Major Volkov closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Sergeant Kozlov, may I speak to you off the record for a moment?" Elena nodded, curious about what he wanted to discuss. "I've been a soldier for 26 years, Major Volkov said quietly. "I've served in conflicts that most people have never heard of, in places that don't exist on official maps. I've seen soldiers do terrible things in the name of duty, and I've seen others do heroic things that no one will ever know about."
He paused, choosing his words carefully.
"What you did with Captain Morrison, it wasn't militarily sound. It violated your orders and put the mission at risk. But it was also one of the most fundamentally human acts I've encountered in my entire career." Elena remained silent, not sure how to respond to such an unexpected admission. "War makes monsters of us all, to one degree or another," Major Volkov continued. "We become so focused on completing missions and following orders that we sometimes forget that our enemies are people too, with families and hopes and fears just like us.
You remembered that even when it would have been easier to forget.
Elena found her voice. I couldn't just kill him, sir. Not when I saw him trying to hide his parachute, trying to survive. He wasn't threatening anyone at that moment. He was just a man who wanted to go home. Major Volkov nodded slowly. And that recognition of shared humanity might be the most important thing any soldier can remember. I hope you'll carry that lesson with you in your new assignment. The Major stood to leave, but Elena had one more question. Sir, what happened to Captain Morrison? Is he all right?
He's fine, Major Volkov replied.
His injuries are healing and he's being well treated. There are ongoing negotiations for a prisoner exchange, so he'll probably be home within a few months. Elena felt a profound sense of relief. Whatever else happened, Morrison would survive to see his family again. That made everything she had sacrificed worthwhile. After Major Volkov left, Elena was transferred to a transportation unit that would take her to a new assignment. As the military truck carried her through the mountain roads she had traveled on foot just days earlier, she reflected on how much her life had changed in such a short time. Her new posting was at a training facility several hundred kilometers from the front lines, a sprawling complex of barracks, firing ranges, and classrooms where new recruits learned the basics of military service. Elena was assigned to the marksmanship section, where she would teach young soldiers the fundamentals of shooting and fieldcraft. The work was different from anything she had done before, but Elena found that she enjoyed it more than she had expected. The recruits were eager to learn, and she discovered that she had a talent for breaking down complex skills into understandable components. Her reputation had preceded her, and the students treated her with a mixture of respect and awe that made her slightly uncomfortable. 6 months into her new assignment, Elena received an unexpected visitor. She was on the firing range, working with a group of recruits on long-distance shooting techniques, when her supervisor approached and told her that someone wanted to see her in the administration building. Elena assumed it was another intelligence officer with follow-up questions about the Morrison incident, something that happened periodically as various departments reviewed her case. But when she walked into the conference room, she found herself face-to-face with Captain James Morrison. He was dressed in civilian clothes and looked healthy and well-rested, a marked contrast to the injured and exhausted man she had last seen being led away by Major Volkov's soldiers. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither quite sure what to say. "Captain Morrison," Elena said finally, "I didn't expect to see you again." Morrison smiled, and Elena could see genuine warmth in his expression. "Please call me James. I'm not a captain anymore. I got out of the military after the prisoner exchange." "Why?" Elena asked, genuinely curious. "I would have thought your escape and evasion experience would make you valuable to your Air Force." James's expression became more serious. "Because what happened in those mountains changed me. I couldn't go back to flying combat missions after that. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that someone I was supposed to consider an enemy had risked everything to save my life." Elena gestured for him to sit down at the conference table. "How did you find me?" "It wasn't easy," James admitted. "I had to call in a lot of favors and make some unofficial inquiries. But I needed to see you again, to thank you properly for what you did." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said. "I made my choice and I accepted the consequences." "But that's exactly why I needed to come here," James insisted. "You made a choice that cost you your career and nearly cost you your freedom. You did it for someone you had never met, someone your country considered an enemy. I needed to tell you that it mattered." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "What are you doing now, if you're not in the military anymore?" James's expression brightened. "I'm working with an international organization that provides humanitarian aid in conflict zones. We help civilians who are caught in the middle of wars regardless of which side they're supposed to be on. It seemed like the right thing to do, considering what I learnt about the importance of seeing people as individuals rather than enemies." Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest. The idea that her actions had inspired someone to dedicate their life to helping others was more rewarding than any medal or commendation could have been. "There's something else," James continued. "The organization I work for is looking for people with military experience who understand both sides of conflict, people who can work in dangerous areas and help bridge the gap between opposing forces." Elena realized where the conversation was heading. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance to use your skills and experience to save lives instead of taking them," James said. "It would mean leaving the military, leaving your country, and taking on work that can be dangerous and frustrating. But it would also mean making a difference in the lives of people who need help. Elena considered the offer. She had found satisfaction in her teaching role, but the idea of doing work that directly helped people appealed to her in a way that surprised her. It would be a complete change of life, abandoning everything she had known for an uncertain future in service of strangers. "I need time to think about it," Elena said. James nodded and pulled a business card from his pocket. "Take all the time you need. When you're ready to decide, call me." After James left, Elena spent long hours thinking about his offer. She walked the grounds of the training facility, sat in her quarters, and lay awake at night weighing the pros and cons of such a dramatic life change. Her military career had been her entire adult life, and leaving it would mean starting over completely. But she also remembered the feeling she had experienced in the mountains when she decided to help Morrison instead of killing him. It had been the first time in years that she felt like she was doing something that aligned with her deepest values, rather than simply following orders. 3 weeks later, Elena made her decision. She submitted her resignation from the military and began the complex process of leaving her country to work with James's humanitarian organization. The bureaucracy was challenging, and some of her former colleagues questioned her decision, but Elena found that each step toward her new life felt more right than the last. 6 months later, Elena was working in a refugee camp in a different conflict zone, helping to provide security for medical personnel treating civilians displaced by war. It was difficult work, often dangerous, and always heartbreaking, but it was also the most fulfilling thing she had ever done. She worked alongside James and a team of other former military personnel from various countries, all of them united by a shared commitment to helping people caught in the crossfire of conflicts they hadn't chosen. Elena's sniper training proved valuable in unexpected ways, as her ability to observe and assess dangerous situations helped keep the medical team safe while they did their work. One evening, as Elena and James were reviewing security arrangements for a medical convoy, he brought up the incident that had brought them together. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up your military career to save someone you didn't even know?" Elena considered the question, looking out at the refugee camp where thousands of displaced people were trying to rebuild their lives with the help of the organization they worked for. "No," she said finally. "I think that moment in the mountains was when I finally understood what I was really fighting for. Not for governments or politics or territory, but for the idea that every person has value, regardless of which uniform they wear or which flag they serve."
James nodded, understanding.
"That's a harder fight than most people realize." "Yes," Elena agreed, "but it's the only fight that really matters." As the sun set over the refugee camp, Elena reflected on the strange path her life had taken. A single decision to show mercy instead of following orders had led her to a completely different existence. One where she used her skills to protect rather than eliminate, to build bridges rather than destroy them. She thought about the moment when she had Morrison in her crosshairs, when everything that followed had balanced on the pressure of her finger against the trigger. Such a small action, or in this case, the decision not to act, but it had changed everything. Elena had learned that the most important battles are often fought not on traditional battlefields, but in the quiet moments when individuals must choose between what they're ordered to do and what they believe is right. She had made a choice, and it had led her to a life she could never have imagined but wouldn't trade for anything. In the end, the sharpshooter's ultimate choice hadn't been about perfect accuracy or following orders. It had been about recognizing the humanity in an enemy and choosing compassion over duty. That choice had brought Morrison back to his family, but more importantly, it had brought both Elena and James to a life dedicated to ensuring that others could find their way back home as well. The ripples of that single moment of mercy continued to spread, touching the lives of refugees and displaced people who would never know the names of the sniper and the pilot whose story had led to their rescue. But Elena knew, and that knowledge was enough to make every difficult day worthwhile. Sometimes the most important shot is the one you don't take, and sometimes the greatest victory comes from recognizing that your supposed enemy is simply another person trying to find their way home. Elena had learned that lesson in a moment of crisis, and she had built the rest of her life around sharing that understanding with anyone who needed to hear it. The war that had brought Elena and Morrison together eventually ended, as all wars do. But the choice Elena made in those mountains continued to echo, a testament to the idea that individual acts of conscience can change the world in ways both small and profound. Her ultimate sharpshooter choice had indeed brought Morrison back, but it also brought both of them to something far more valuable than they had ever lost.